Moses instructed Israel in every area of life.
Okay.
We are separated from his time several thousand years. The world is academically, economically, and culturally advanced from the time of Moses. How can we still consider Mosaic instructions relevant today?
The knowledge and understanding of the world has increased manifold. From the time of Moses, in the area of science, technology, and culture. When you look at the time of Moses and our time, we can say that there's a lot of knowledge, intellectual understanding of the universe, the world, the culture, and people, life, and everything. But what the Bible is talking about is the nature of man. Whatever the advances we could have made in technology and culture and education has not changed the nature of the human being, and he is still sinful, morally deficient. And therefore, when you look at the Bible that addresses this question of human sinful nature that impacts his social and spiritual relationship. The man who was given dominion over the creation by God now lost his dominion. The dominion implies that God made man a trustee over his creation, and that required stewardship. There are a couple of things here. When God entrusted the nature or the creation in the hands of man as a trustee, man is supposed to have the stewardship. There is leadership. The leadership God gave was a responsible leadership. It is not an oppressive leadership. That is why he has to take care of the creation that God had created. So in the beginning, before the sin, there was a perfect nature environment, and there was no kind of an oppressive leadership, killing even. There was no killing. And therefore, God had entrusted in the hands of man this stewardship God expected. God owns the earth. God is the owner. And its resources. And God gave man the responsibility to manage the resources. It is for all creation, and therefore there is no question of domination. See, this is God's intention of entrusting the nature in the hands of man. God had created, God had given this to man for stewardship. That means that the resources of the earth is for everybody. And that prevents individual lordship over the land or the resources. And there is a responsibility of sharing the resources with everybody. Sharing the resources with other people in the community. Sharing the resources with also the animal kingdom that is around us. And the second point, that the dominion that God gave in Genesis 1:26, it says the subduing of the earth. Subduing meant, or subduing the earth entails work on the part of man. He has to work hard. It is man's responsibility and right to be engaged in productive economic work with its resources. Now, there are two things here. One is, it is for all, a shared resources. Secondly, man had the responsibility to work in order to receive the product or the produce of the earth. Thirdly, the use of resources of the earth is a shared right, which sets the moral limitation to private ownership of resources. All these principles were affected by sin. By the fall of man, It had an impact on all these principles. They were corrupted, violated to man's own cost. The fall made man arrogant in his desire to dominate, a rebellion against God's authority and benevolence. It affected his relationship with God and society. This impacted his economic and material environment. Now, we can talk about why Moses gave the laws that will affect every area of life. Because this is what happened because of the fall of man. The land and resources became the greatest single cause for war and killing. And few dominated the wealth and enslaved other people. It became a tool of oppression and greed for power. The work became a drudgery. What was a pleasant activity in the Garden of Eden has now become, because of sin, a drudgery and became a necessity for survival. Human relationship in economic work was corrupted. No care was given to the workers' welfare. But work became a commodity to be bought and sold. Oppression and slavery due to greed that replaced God and His love. Economic growth became an obsession. The struggle is not merely physical or material, but spiritual, where spiritual forces and powers influence human economic relationships and hold them in spiritual darkness. If we read Romans chapter 1, verse 21, where Paul is pointing out, the futile thinking, the speculative thinking of man has corrupted his heart and made his life, his heart, his thinking, and his everything darkened. The spiritual aspect, where he cannot think straight, he cannot care for his fellow people, he cannot work in order to enjoy, but the work also became corrupt. So God's redemption of Israel gave them political, social, economic, and religious freedom that became the foundation for God's covenant with them. And the laws related to these in their life. That's what it means. Because in this condition of the fallen world and the fallen nature of man, the redeemed society, God's people, God gave them laws which covered political, social, economic, and the religious spheres. And that became the foundation for the covenant or the agreement God made with the people. Politically, Israel was a theocratic nation. Though they had a king, yet God was a real king. They were thus ruled by the religious understanding of God. That's where comes the righteous rule. And so the civil laws, as you said, all that comes out of this. And they were supposed to rule righteously, see in the society there is justice and a punishment if somebody violated the right of somebody else in the society. All these are administration that came out of their understanding and relationship with God. Socially and economically, the law of inheritance. Now that was a very important law that you see God gave to His people, the law of inheritance. And the law of inheritance is each family is given a piece of land. What it actually speaks about is an equal share of the property and the resources to live. Nobody would be there without any resources to live. The laws of Sabbath, sabbatical year, jubilee year. What is the function of these, sabbatical, Sabbath, and jubilee year, the 50th year, is they regulated the ownership. Because of some need, a person may mortgage his hand to another person, borrow money. But this land, whether this person pays back the money or not, must be returned to the original owner. And therefore, the equality of the society would be regulated and maintained. And all the slaves, they must be released. The Jubilee year is called the year of freedom. And you will find the laws of tithes. The tithes that we give to God, because that will take care of the worship, the priest, and the others who do not have the land inheritance, because God Himself was their inheritance. But also every third year, there is additional tithes would be collected. And this was specifically meant for the poor, the widows, and the orphans. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 24 and Leviticus chapter 19, also verse 23, you will find all these laws concerning the poor and the tithes of the third year. A specific, money on the resources from the land would be set apart for the poor. And therefore, God said in these passages, there will not be any poor among you. Take care of them. And therefore, you see that the Mosaic law that covered all these aspects. You look at the land laws, harvest laws. The person who owns the land during the harvest, he should not just clean the land, but rather leave something behind, so that when the poor comes around, he must find something there. And the law says, if that person does not find anything and complains to God, God will hear that person's prayer. You can look at the heart of God for this poor. You can look at the significance of this law for the people, because they are all God's people. They are all equal in the sight of God. The resources God gave needs to be shared equally. There cannot be a slave. There cannot be interest charged for the money that you would lend to the poor people. You cannot take poor man's garment as a pledge for the money that you give to someone. And therefore, if you look at these laws, all these talk about their entire life system. Your personal life, your social life, your relationships, and your family. And therefore, the lifestyle as a whole, God had given to the people, with all these system and the laws and the, way of living, you can really see this as God's community. That is why Deuteronomy 4 I mentioned earlier, the people around, they will see and would say, indeed, you are a wise people that God had called you. That's the law that we have.